The spring storm hit Montana territory so hard that Mack Xander could barely see his own horse's ears through the driving rain. But he pressed forward anyway, because a cowboy who turned back at the first sign of trouble was no cowboy at all. The year was 1878, and Mack had been riding fence lines for the Double R Ranch outside of what would someday become the town of Montrose when the weather turned vicious. Thunder cracked overhead like rifle shots, and lightning illuminated the prairie in brilliant white flashes that left him half blind. He was searching for shelter when he heard it, a sound that cut through even the howling wind. A woman's voice, high and desperate, calling for help. Mack wheeled his paint gelding toward the sound, squinting through the rain. There, barely visible in the downpour, stood a small barn that he had never noticed before. The structure looked weathered but solid, and the cry had definitely come from that direction. He urged his horse forward, and as they drew closer he could make out a woman in the doorway, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face. "Help me, please," she shouted over the storm. "Something's wrong with my mare." Mack didn't hesitate. He dismounted quickly, leading his gelding into the barn behind the woman. The interior was dim, lit only by a single lantern hanging from a beam, but it was dry and relatively warm. He shook the water from his hat and turned to get a better look at the woman who had called to him. She was young, probably around 22 or 23, with striking green eyes that were currently wide with panic. Her dress was simple but well made, suggesting she wasn't wealthy but took pride in her appearance. Even in her distressed state, there was something beautiful about her, something that made Mack's heart skip in a way he hadn't felt in years. "My name's Beatrice Olson," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I live here alone, just me and my animals. My mare, she's trying to foal, but something's wrong. I've helped with births before, but this one isn't right. The foal's positioned wrong and I can't reach properly. My hands are too small." Mack followed her gaze to the far stall, where a chestnut mare lay on her side in the straw, her flanks heaving with effort. The horse's eyes rolled white with pain and fear, and Mack could see immediately that Beatrice was right. This wasn't a normal birth. "I'm Mack Xander," he said, already moving toward the stall. "I've helped deliver more foals than I can count. Let me take a look." He rolled up his sleeves and approached the mare slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. The horse was exhausted, that much was clear. She had been laboring for too long. Mack knelt in the straw and examined her carefully, his experienced hands gentle but thorough. "The foal's turned wrong," he confirmed, looking up at Beatrice. "One leg's folded back. I need to reach in and straighten it out, but it's going to be difficult." "I'll need your help." Beatrice nodded, her fear giving way to determination. "Tell me what to do." For the next hour they worked together in the dim lamplight while the storm raged outside. Mack talked constantly to the mare, his voice calm and steady, while his hands worked to reposition the foal. Beatrice stayed at the horse's head, stroking her neck and murmuring encouragement. Several times, Mack had to stop and rest his arms, the physical strain enormous, but he never gave up. Beatrice would use those moments to wipe the sweat from his forehead with a clean cloth, her touch gentle and grateful. "Almost there," Mack said through gritted teeth. "Come on, girl, work with me." With one final adjustment, he felt the foal shift into the correct position. "That's it. Now we just need to let nature take its course. Get ready." The mare, sensing that something had changed, gathered her strength for one more push. Beatrice gripped Mack's shoulder, her fingers digging in as they watched together. Then, in a rush of fluid and movement, the foal slid free into Mack's waiting hands. It was a colt, small and perfect, his coat already showing the promise of his mother's rich chestnut color. For a moment he lay still, and Mack's heart clenched with fear. But then Beatrice grabbed a handful of straw and began rubbing the foal vigorously, clearing his nostrils and stimulating him to breathe. The colt's sides heaved once, twice, and then he let out a small, indignant whinny. Beatrice laughed, the sound bright with relief and joy. "He's alive." "Oh, thank God, he's alive." The mare lifted her head, nickering softly to her baby. Mack moved back to give her room as she struggled to her feet and began cleaning her foal with long strokes of her tongue. The colt responded by trying to stand, his long legs tangling beneath him in the adorable awkwardness of all newborns. Mack sat back in the straw, exhausted but satisfied. Beatrice sank down beside him, and for a long moment they simply watched the mare and her foal together, sharing in the miracle of new life. "I can't thank you enough," Beatrice said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "If you hadn't come along when you did, I would have lost them both. That mare, she's all I have left of my father. He died last winter and she was his favorite horse. This colt, he's precious beyond measure." Mack turned to look at her and saw tears streaming down her face. Without thinking, he reached out and gently wiped them away with his thumb. "I'm glad I could help." Their eyes met and held. Something passed between them in that moment, something wordless and profound. The storm outside seemed to fade away, and all that existed was this small barn, the new life they had helped bring into the world, and the sudden, unexpected connection that had formed between two strangers. Beatrice took a shaky breath and looked away first, but Mack noticed that a faint blush had colored her cheeks. "You must think I'm foolish, crying like this." "Not at all," Mack said softly. "There's nothing foolish about caring deeply for something." She looked back at him, and this time her smile was warm and genuine. "You're very kind, and you clearly have a gift with horses. Where did you learn?" "I grew up on a ranch in Texas," Mack explained, settling back against the stall wall. "My father was a horse breeder, one of the best. He taught me everything he knew before he passed on 5 years ago. After that, I couldn't stay on the ranch anymore. Too many memories. So I drifted north and ended up here in Montana territory." "I understand about memories," Beatrice said quietly. "This place is full of them for me. My father built this barn with his own hands. We moved here 3 years ago from Minnesota, hoping to start fresh after my mother died. He wanted to breed horses, build something good out of our grief. He managed to buy this land and the mare, but then his heart gave out during the winter. The doctor said he had been sick for a while but never told anyone." "So you've been managing alone?" Mack asked, concern coloring his voice. Beatrice nodded. "It hasn't been easy. I do sewing and mending for some of the ranches nearby, and I have a small vegetable garden. I was counting on this foal to help me start building my father's dream. If I can raise him right and train him well, I can sell him for enough money to buy another mare and really start breeding horses properly." Mack was quiet for a moment, watching the foal as he finally managed to get his legs sorted out and stood, wobbling but triumphant. "That's a good plan. This colt has excellent lines if his mother is anything to go by." "She is," Beatrice said with pride. "My father bought her from a breeder in Kentucky. She's got racing blood 3 generations back." They sat together in comfortable silence, both too tired to move just yet. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder growing more distant. Beatrice's head drooped, and before she knew it, she was leaning against Mack's shoulder, her eyes closing with exhaustion. Mack didn't move, afraid to disturb her. He was acutely aware of her warmth against his side, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite the horse and sweat. Something was stirring in his chest, something he had thought long dead after the disappointment of his last relationship back in Texas. He had sworn off women, convinced that a drifter like him had no business trying to build anything permanent. But sitting here with Beatrice, feeling like he had just found something precious and unexpected, those old walls were starting to crumble. Beatrice stirred and sat up suddenly, her eyes wide with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to fall asleep on you like that." "It's all right," Mack said, meaning it. "It's been a long night for both of us." She stood up, brushing straw from her skirt, and moved to check on the mare and foal. The colt was nursing now, his little tail flicking with contentment. "Look at him. He's perfect." Mack joined her at the stall, and they stood side by side, watching the peaceful scene. "What will you name him?" Beatrice thought for a moment. "I think I'll call him Storm, for the night he was born, and because he fought his way into this world with the same fierceness as that weather outside." "Storm," Mack repeated, testing the name. "I like it, it suits him." Beatrice turned to face Mack fully, and in the lamplight he could see that her expression had grown serious. "Mack, I meant what I said before. I can never fully repay you for what you did tonight, but I want to promise you something." "You don't owe me anything," Mack started to say, but she held up her hand. "Please, let me finish. My father believed in the old ways, in the power of promises made from the heart. He always said that if you make a promise with true intention, the universe finds a way to make it come true." She took a deep breath, and Mack could see that she was choosing her words carefully. "Tonight, I promise you this. You will never again know the loneliness of drifting without a home. You will find a place where you belong, where you're needed and wanted. And you will find love, real and lasting love, with someone who sees all that you are and cherishes it." The words hung in the air between them, solemn and sacred. Mack felt a lump form in his throat. "That's quite a promise." "I mean every word," Beatrice said, and the conviction in her voice made him believe her. "You gave me hope tonight. You saved something precious to me, so I'm promising you hope in return." Before Mack could respond, before he could tell her that he was already beginning to believe her promise might come true, because of her, not despite his circumstances, there was a sound from outside. They both turned toward the door as it burst open, and a young man stumbled in, soaked and breathless. "Miss Beatrice," the boy gasped. He couldn't have been more than 16, with red hair plastered to his skull and freckles standing out starkly on his pale face. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Your neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, she sent me. There's been an accident at the Jenkins place. A tree came down in the storm and crashed through their roof. They need every pair of hands they can get to help with repairs and to move the family's belongings to safety." Beatrice didn't hesitate. "Of course, tell them I'll be there as soon as I can." She turned to Mack. "The Jenkinses have 6 children. They'll need all the help they can get." "I'll come with you," Mack said immediately. The boy, whose name turned out to be Timothy, nodded gratefully and rushed back out into the rain, which had lessened to a steady drizzle. Beatrice quickly checked on the mare and foal one more time, ensuring they had water and feed, and then she and Mack mounted their horses and headed out. The Jenkins place was about 2 miles from Beatrice's barn, and when they arrived, the scene was one of controlled chaos. A massive cottonwood had indeed come down, its trunk punching through the roof of the small farmhouse and into what appeared to be the main living area. Neighbors from all around had already gathered, and everyone was working together to salvage what they could and to tarp the hole in the roof before more rain could get in. Mack threw himself into the work, his strong back and capable hands making quick work of hauling broken beams and moving furniture. Beatrice coordinated with the other women to pack up the family's clothes and kitchen goods, making sure the 6 Jenkins children were kept calm and occupied. The youngest was only 3 years old, and she clung to Beatrice's skirts, sucking her thumb and whimpering. "It's all right, sweetness. Beatrice murmured, lifting the little girl onto her hip. "We're going to make everything right again." Mack caught sight of her comforting the child and felt his heart squeeze. She was a natural caretaker, gentle and patient. He could imagine her with children of her own someday, and the thought stirred something fierce and protective inside him. They worked through the remainder of the night and into the early morning. By the time the sun rose, watery and pale, the worst of the damage had been contained. The Jenkins family would stay with the Hendersons for a few days while repairs were made, but thanks to the community's quick response, they hadn't lost much. As people began to disperse, exhausted but satisfied with the night's work, Mack found himself riding back toward Beatrice's barn with her. Neither of them had spoken much during the rescue efforts, too focused on the task at hand, but now, in the quiet dawn light, there was space for conversation again. "You have good neighbors," Mack observed. "The best," Beatrice agreed. "Out here we have to rely on each other. The land is too hard and the winters too harsh to survive alone." She paused, then added quietly, "Though I confess, there are times when I feel very alone indeed." Mack glanced at her. Her profile was lit by the rising sun, and she looked tired but beautiful. "How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?" 22, Beatrice said. "Old enough to have been married twice over by most people's standards, but my father needed me after my mother died, and then I needed to care for him. There wasn't time for courting or thinking about my own future." She looked over at him. "What about you?" 26, Mack replied. "And I've been too busy drifting to put down roots. I had a girl back in Texas, but she married someone else when she realized I was serious about leaving. Can't say I blame her. A woman needs stability, not a man who can't stay in one place." "Maybe you were just waiting for the right reason to stay," Beatrice suggested softly. Their eyes met, and Mack felt that pull again, that sense of recognition and possibility. But before he could respond, they arrived back at her barn. The mare and foal were both doing well, and Beatrice insisted on making Mack breakfast as a proper thank you. Her cabin, which sat about 50 yards from the barn, was small but tidy. One large room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a curtained alcove for sleeping. Everything was neat and clean, with small touches that spoke of a woman making the best of what she had. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, cheerful yellow curtains at the windows, a beautiful quilt folded over the back of the single chair. Beatrice set about making coffee and frying eggs and bacon while Mack washed up at the basin. He felt strangely at home in this little cabin, more at home than he had felt anywhere since leaving Texas. When Beatrice set a plate before him, he realized he was ravenous, and the food tasted like the best meal he had ever eaten. "This is delicious," he said sincerely. "It's nothing fancy," Beatrice demurred, but she looked pleased. She sat down across from him with her own plate, and they ate in companionable silence for a few moments. "Where will you go now?" Beatrice asked finally. "Back to the Double R Ranch." Mack considered the question. The truth was, he had been thinking about moving on from the Double R for a while now. The foreman was a hard man who cared more about squeezing every ounce of work from his hands than about treating them fairly. Mack had been planning to ride out at the end of the month, maybe head further north or perhaps west toward the mountains. But now, looking at Beatrice across the table, seeing the hope and something deeper in her green eyes, he found himself hesitating. "I suppose I will, at least for now. But I'll come back to check on Storm if that's all right with you. Make sure he's growing strong." Beatrice's face lit up. "I'd like that very much. In fact, I'd be grateful for any advice you could give me about training him. I know the basics, but my father was the real expert, and there's still so much I don't know." "I'd be happy to help," Mack said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. They made arrangements for Mack to return in a week's time, and then, reluctantly, he prepared to leave. Beatrice walked him out to his horse, and as he mounted up, she reached up and placed her hand on his knee. "Thank you again, Mack Xander, for everything." "It was my pleasure, Beatrice Olson," he replied, and on impulse he reached down and covered her hand with his. They stayed like that for a heartbeat, and then Mack reluctantly pulled away and turned his horse toward the road. As he rode back to the Double R Ranch, his mind was full of Beatrice. Her courage, her kindness, her determination to honor her father's dream despite the odds stacked against her. And that promise she had made, those words about finding a home and love. They echoed in his head, taking root in the places where hope had long since withered. The week that followed was the longest of Mack's life. He went through the motions at the ranch, mending fences and breaking horses, but his thoughts were always elsewhere. At night, lying in his bunk in the ranch's bunkhouse, he would think about Beatrice's smile, the way she had leaned against him in the barn, the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him. The other ranch hands noticed his distraction and teased him mercilessly, but Mack took it good-naturedly. One of them, an older cowboy named Dutch who had worked ranches from Mexico to Canada, pulled him aside one evening. "You got that look," Dutch said, his weathered face creasing into a knowing grin. "What look?" Mack asked, though he knew perfectly well what Dutch meant. "The look of a man who's just realized he's in deep. Whatever it is, or whoever she is, don't fight it too hard. Life's too short, and good women are too rare." Mack thought about that advice as the days crawled by. Was he falling for Beatrice? They had only spent one night together, and most of that had been focused on the mare and foal. But he couldn't deny the connection he felt, the sense that something important had shifted in his world. When the promised week was finally up, Mack asked the foreman for a day off. The man agreed grudgingly, and Mack set out early in the morning, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He stopped in town on the way, using some of his carefully saved wages to buy a few things: a bag of sugar, some coffee beans, and a small book about horse training that he had seen in the general store's window. He also bought a length of pretty blue ribbon on impulse, thinking it would look nice in Beatrice's dark hair. When he arrived at her cabin, Beatrice came out to meet him, and Mack's breath caught. She was wearing a different dress than before, a soft green that matched her eyes, and her hair was pinned up, though a few tendrils had escaped to frame her face. She looked happy to see him, her smile bright and genuine. "Mack, I was hoping you'd come today. Storm has grown so much already, you won't believe it." They walked to the barn together, and Mack presented her with his gifts. Beatrice's eyes grew wide when she saw the book, and she clutched it to her chest like a treasure. "This must have cost you dearly," she protested, but Mack waved off her concerns. "Consider it an investment in Storm's future, and speaking of Storm, let's see how he's doing." The colt was indeed thriving. He was already stronger on his legs, and he greeted them with a curious nicker, investigating Mack's pockets with his soft nose in search of treats. Mack laughed and produced an apple, which he broke into pieces for both the mare and her baby. For the next several hours, Mack and Beatrice worked with the horses. He showed her exercises to strengthen the mare's bond with her foal and early handling techniques that would make Storm easier to train when he was older. Beatrice was an apt pupil, quick and attentive, and Mack found himself impressed by how naturally she moved around the horses. They broke for lunch, and Beatrice brought out sandwiches and lemonade. They sat on a blanket outside the barn, enjoying the warm spring day. The Montana landscape stretched out around them, vast and beautiful, the mountains purple in the distance. "Tell me about Texas," Beatrice said, lying back on the blanket and looking up at the clouds. What was it like growing up there? Mack stretched out beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance, and began to talk. He told her about the ranch where he had grown up, about his father's skill with horses and his mother's beautiful singing voice. He talked about the hot summers and the way the bluebonnets would carpet the fields in spring. He even told her about the girl who had broken his heart, though he found that the pain of that memory had faded to a dull ache. In turn, Beatrice talked about Minnesota, about ice fishing with her father in winter, and the way her mother used to make the best wild berry pies. She talked about the grief that had brought them to Montana and the hope they had carried with them. "You ever think about going back?" Mack asked. "To Minnesota," Beatrice shook her head. "No, my life is here now. This is where my father's dream is buried along with him. I owe it to his memory to see it through." "You don't owe your whole life to a memory," Mack said gently. "Maybe not," Beatrice agreed, turning her head to look at him. "But maybe building this dream will help me build my own future at the same time. I'm not just doing this for him, Mack. I'm doing it for me too. I want to prove that I can make something of myself, that I'm not just a woman waiting for a man to give her life meaning." Mack propped himself up on his elbow, looking down at her. "I don't think anyone could accuse you of that. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Beatrice's eyes softened. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Mack said quietly. "I know you're brave and kind and determined. I know you keep promises and work hard and treat people with respect. That's more than I can say for most folks I've met." A blush crept up Beatrice's cheeks, and she sat up, suddenly shy. "You're too generous in your assessment. I'm only being honest." They looked at each other, and Mack saw his own feelings reflected in Beatrice's eyes. The growing affection, the attraction, the fear of being hurt, but also the willingness to take the risk. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and tucked one of those escaped tendrils of hair behind her ear. "Beatrice," he began, his voice rough with emotion. But before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. They both stood quickly, brushing grass from their clothes, as 3 riders appeared over the rise. Mack recognized them as Double R hands, and his stomach sank. This couldn't be good. The lead rider was the foreman, Jake Sterling, a thick-necked man with mean eyes and a reputation for cruelty. He reined in his horse hard, making the animal toss its head, and glared down at Mack. "So this is where you've been sneaking off to," Sterling said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Should have known you'd be sniffing around some woman instead of doing your job." Mack's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice level. "I asked for a day off and you granted it. I'm doing nothing wrong." "That's so." Sterling's gaze shifted to Beatrice, looking her up and down in a way that made Mack's blood boil. "This your little fancy, Xander?" "Not much to look at, but I suppose out here you can't be too choosy." "You watch your mouth," Mack said, his voice going dangerously quiet. Beatrice put a hand on his arm. "It's all right, Mack, he's not worth it." But Sterling wasn't done. "You're fired, Xander." "I don't pay men to waste time with women when there's work to be done. Pack your things and get off Double R land." "Fine by me," Mack shot back. "I was planning on quitting anyway. I don't work for men who don't know the meaning of decency." Sterling's face purpled with rage, and for a moment, Mack thought the man might actually try to draw on him. But one of the other riders, an older man Mack knew slightly, put a restraining hand on Sterling's arm. "Let it go, Jake. He's not worth the trouble." Sterling shook off the hand and spat into the dirt at Mack's feet. "You've got until sundown to clear out." Then he wheeled his horse around and rode off, the other 2 men following behind. Mack watched them go, his jaw tight with anger. When he turned back to Beatrice, he expected to see fear or worry in her eyes. Instead, he saw fury. "What a vile man," she said, her voice shaking. How dare he speak to you like that? How dare he speak to me like that? I'm sorry, Max said. I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door. Don't you dare apologize, Beatrice said fiercely. You did nothing wrong. That man is a bully and a coward, and the world would be better off without him. She took a deep breath, visibly calming herself. But now you're out of a job. What will you do? It was a good question. Mack had some money saved, but not much. He would need to find work quickly, and jobs weren't easy to come by in this part of Montana territory. He could head to one of the bigger towns, maybe Virginia City or Helena, but the thought of leaving Beatrice made his chest ache. As if she could read his thoughts, Beatrice said, "You could stay here." Mack looked at her in surprise. "What?" "Stay here," Beatrice repeated, her words coming faster now. "I can't pay you much, but I can offer room and board. I need help with the horses, and you need a place to stay." "It makes sense." "Beatrice, I can't impose on you like that. People will talk." "Let them talk," Beatrice said, lifting her chin defiantly. "I'm so tired of worrying about what people think. You're a good man, Mack, and I trust you. Besides, you could sleep in the barn. It wouldn't be improper." Mack wanted to say yes more than he had wanted anything in a long time, but he forced himself to think practically. "What about supplies? Food? I eat a lot. I told you, I do sewing and mending for several ranches. And now that Storm is here and thriving, I can start thinking about buying another mare sooner than I planned. If you help me train Storm properly, we could sell him for a good price in a year or so. Or maybe even breed him when he's old enough. We could build something here, Mack. Together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, laden with possibility. Mack searched Beatrice's face and saw only sincerity and hope. "All right," he said finally. "I'll stay at least for a while, but I insist on earning my keep. I won't be a charity case." Beatrice's smile was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "You'll earn it, I promise. There's more work here than I can handle alone." They shook hands on it, a formal gesture that felt both too much and not enough. Then Mack mounted his horse and rode back to the Double R to collect his belongings. Sterling was nowhere to be seen, which was a blessing, and Mack packed up his few possessions quickly. As he was leaving, Dutch caught up with him. "Heard you got canned," the old cowboy said. "That's rough." "I'll manage," Mack replied. Dutch studied him for a moment, then grinned. "This have anything to do with that woman you've been mooning over?" Mack couldn't help but smile. "Maybe." "Good for you, son, good for you." Dutch clapped him on the shoulder. "You ever need anything, you know where to find me." "Thanks, Dutch. That means a lot." By the time Mack returned to Beatrice's place, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Beatrice had prepared the barn for him, laying out fresh straw and blankets in the empty stall next to the mares. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and dry, and Mack had slept in worse places. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a routine. Mack would wake before dawn and tend to the horses, then help Beatrice with whatever needed doing around the property. There was always something: a fence to mend, a roof to patch, firewood to chop. In the afternoons, they would work with Storm, getting him used to being handled and teaching him basic manners. And in the evenings, after the work was done, they would sit together on the porch of Beatrice's cabin and talk. Sometimes they would discuss practical matters, like how much grain to buy or when to plant the garden. But more often, they would talk about their dreams, their fears, their pasts. With every conversation, Mack felt himself growing closer to Beatrice, and he could see the same thing happening for her. One evening, about a month after Mack had moved in, they were sitting on the porch watching the stars come out when Beatrice suddenly said, "I'm glad you stayed." Mack turned to look at her. "So am I. I mean it," Beatrice continued, her voice soft. "This past month has been the happiest I've been since my father died. maybe even happier than that. You make me laugh, Mac. You make me feel like I can actually achieve what I've set out to do. You make me feel less alone. You do the same for me, Max said honestly. I spent so long drifting, convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that I was better off on my own. But being here with you, I've realized how wrong I was. I was just afraid. Afraid of being hurt, afraid of failing, afraid of wanting something and not being able to have it. And now, Beatrice asked, her green eyes searching his face. Now I'm still afraid, Mac admitted. But I'm more afraid of losing this, of losing you, than I am of taking a risk. Beatrice reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Remember what I promised you that night in the barn, that you would find love, I remember. I think your promise is coming true, Mac, because I'm falling in love with you. I think I started that very first night when you were so gentle with the mare and so determined to save her foal. I've been trying to fight it, telling myself it's too soon, that I barely know you. But my heart doesn't seem to care about logic. Mac's breath caught. He turned on the bench so he was facing her fully and cupped her face in his hands. Beatrice, I'm in love with you too. I have been for weeks now, maybe from the beginning. You're everything I've ever wanted and didn't know I was looking for. Then he kissed her, a soft, sweet kiss that tasted of promise and new beginnings. Beatrice kissed him back, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, and for a long, perfect moment, the world faded away until there was nothing but the two of them and the love growing between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Beatrice was smiling through happy tears. What do we do now? Now, Max said, wiping away her tears with his thumbs, we build the future together. We raise Storm, we buy more horses, we make your father's dream come true. And somewhere along the way, if you'll have me, I'd like to make you my wife. Is that a proposal? Beatrice asked, her eyes dancing. It's a statement of intent, Mac replied, grinning. The proposal will come when I can afford a proper ring and do it right. But I wanted you to know where my heart is heading. My heart is heading in the same direction, Beatrice said, and kissed him again. Summer bloomed across Montana territory, and with it, the relationship between Mac and Beatrice deepened and flourished. They were inseparable, working side by side during the day and spending their evenings planning their future. The neighbors had indeed noticed that Mac was living on Beatrice's property, and there was some gossip, but when it became clear that Mac was sleeping in the barn and conducting himself as a perfect gentleman, most of the talk died down. Storm continued to grow, and under Mac's expert training, he was developing into a truly exceptional horse. He was intelligent and willing, with a smooth gait and a gentle temperament. Several people from neighboring ranches had already expressed interest in buying him when he was old enough, but Beatrice and Mac had decided to keep him, at least for now. He would be the foundation of their breeding program. With some of the money Beatrice had saved, and what Mac had contributed from his wages at the Double R, they were able to buy another mare, this one a sturdy gray with good conformation and a calm disposition. They named her Silver, and she got along well with Storm's mother, who they had been calling Chestnut. One morning in late July, Mac woke up with a sense of purpose. He had been saving every penny he could spare, and he finally had enough to buy the ring he had been eyeing in the general store's window. He told Beatrice he needed to ride into town for supplies, which was true enough, and set out early. The town was bustling when he arrived, full of ranchers and their families doing their weekly shopping. Mac made his way to the general store, his heart pounding with anticipation. The ring was still there, a simple gold band with a small but pretty diamond. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest and real, just like his love for Beatrice. He made the purchase, and the store owner, a kindly woman named Mrs. Patterson, wrapped it carefully in brown paper. "She's a lucky woman, whoever she is," Mrs. Patterson said with a warm smile. "I'm the lucky one," Mack replied honestly. He also bought actual supplies, not wanting to return empty-handed, and then stopped at the post office. He had written to his brother in Texas a few weeks ago, telling him about Beatrice and his new life, and he was hoping for a reply. Sure enough, there was a letter waiting for him. Mack tucked the letter into his pocket to read later and rode back to Beatrice's place, his mind whirling with plans. He wanted to propose properly, to make it a moment she would remember for the rest of her life. He decided to wait until evening when they could sit together on the porch and watch the sunset. But when he arrived back at the cabin, he found Beatrice in tears. His heart dropped and he dismounted quickly, rushing to her side. "What's wrong? What happened?" Beatrice looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. "It's Mrs. Henderson. She passed away this morning. Her heart just gave out. Her husband found her in the garden." Mack's relief that nothing had happened to Beatrice was immediately replaced by genuine sorrow. Mrs. Henderson had been kind to Beatrice, one of the few neighbors who had gone out of her way to help a young woman living alone. He pulled Beatrice into his arms, holding her as she cried. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." "She was so good to me," Beatrice sobbed into his shirt. "After my father died, she would bring me food and check on me. She never judged me or made me feel like a burden. And now she's gone, just like that." They stood like that for a long time, Mack simply holding Beatrice and letting her grieve. The ring in his pocket seemed to burn, a reminder that life was precious and short, and that every moment mattered. The funeral was held 2 days later, and the whole community turned out. Mr. Henderson was devastated, barely able to stand, and Beatrice stayed by his side throughout the service, offering quiet comfort. Mack was struck once again by her capacity for compassion, her ability to put aside her own grief to help someone else. After the funeral, there was a gathering at the Henderson place. Mack helped set up tables while Beatrice and the other women laid out food. As he worked, he overheard some of the men talking. "Henderson's saying he can't stay here anymore," one man said. "Too many memories. He's thinking of selling the ranch and moving back east to live with his daughter." "That's a shame," another replied. "It's a good piece of land, prime horse country." Mack's ears perked up at that. The Henderson ranch bordered Beatrice's property, and if they could somehow acquire even part of it, they could expand their operation significantly. But he knew they didn't have that kind of money, not yet. Still, the possibility planted itself in his mind, taking root. That evening, exhausted from the emotional day, Mack and Beatrice sat together on the porch as usual. Beatrice leaned her head on Mack's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her. "Death makes you think, doesn't it?" Beatrice said quietly, "about how quickly everything can change. How nothing is guaranteed." "It does," Mack agreed, thinking of the ring still in his pocket. He had planned to wait for a happier day, but Beatrice's words made him reconsider. Life was uncertain, and there was no point in waiting for the perfect moment. This moment, right here with her, was already perfect in its own way. "Beatrice," he said, shifting so he could look at her properly. "I love you more than I've ever loved anything or anyone. You've given my life meaning and purpose. You've made me believe in hope again, in the possibility of happiness. And I don't want to waste another day without making my intentions clear and official." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring, the paper wrapping crinkling as he opened it. Beatrice's eyes went wide, her hand flying to her mouth. "I know this isn't the most romantic timing, and I know this ring isn't much, but it's real and it's yours if you'll have it. Beatrice Olson, will you marry me?" For a moment, Beatrice just stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Then she launched herself at him, nearly knocking him over, kissing him fiercely. "Yes," she said between kisses. "Yes, yes, yes. I'll marry you, Mack Xander. I would be honored to be your wife." Mack slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. They held each other close, and despite the sadness of the day, despite the uncertainty of the future, they were happy. They had found each other against all odds, and they were going to build a life together. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. They decided to have a simple wedding in late September, after the harvest was in. Beatrice made herself a dress from fabric she had been saving, a beautiful cream color with delicate lace at the collar. Mack bought a new suit, only the second one he had owned in his entire life. They also began making inquiries about the Henderson ranch. Mr. Henderson confirmed that he was indeed planning to sell, and after some negotiation, they worked out an arrangement. The Hendersons would sell them a portion of the land, about 50 acres that bordered Beatrice's property, for a price they could manage with a loan from the bank. It would be tight financially, but with the expanded land, they would have room to grow their horse breeding operation. Mack also received a letter back from his brother, filled with congratulations and well wishes. His brother wrote that he was proud of Mack for finding happiness and that their father would have been too. He also sent a small amount of money as a wedding gift, which touched Mack deeply. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the sky a brilliant blue and the air crisp with the promise of autumn. They were married in the small church in what was now being called Montrose, a town that was growing rapidly as more settlers moved into the area. Beatrice looked radiant in her homemade dress, and Mack couldn't stop smiling as he made his vows. "I promise to love you, honor you, and stand by your side for all the days of my life," he said, his voice steady and sure. "You are my home, Beatrice. Wherever you are, that's where I belong." Beatrice's vows were equally heartfelt. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams as you support mine. You saved more than a foal that night, Mack. You saved me too. I love you with my whole heart." They sealed their vows with a kiss, and their neighbors cheered. The celebration afterward was joyful, with music and dancing and more food than Mack had seen in one place in years. He danced with his new wife, holding her close and marveling at how much his life had changed in just a few short months. That night, as man and wife, they finally shared Beatrice's bed. Mack was gentle and patient, wanting to make sure Beatrice's first time was everything she hoped for. They explored each other slowly, learning what brought pleasure, what made the other gasp and sigh. When they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, a physical confirmation of the emotional bond they had already formed. Afterward, lying tangled together in the sheets, Beatrice traced patterns on Mack's chest. "That promise I made you," she murmured. "About finding love and a home. It came true, didn't it?" "It did," Mack agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Every word of it." "My father used to say that promises made from the heart have power," Beatrice said. "I believe that now more than ever." "We spoke things into existence that night, Mack. We claimed our future." "Then let's make another promise," Mack suggested. "Right here, right now. Let's promise that no matter what challenges come, we'll face them together. That we'll build something lasting, not just for ourselves, but for the children we'll have someday." "I promise," Beatrice whispered. "I promise too," Mack said, and he sealed it with a kiss. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. Mack and Beatrice worked tirelessly to build their horse breeding business, and slowly but surely, it began to pay off. Storm grew into a magnificent stallion, sought after for stud services across Montana territory. They acquired more mares, breeding horses that became known for their intelligence, their temperament, and their beauty. The Henderson land proved to be a wise investment. They built a proper barn there and fenced off pastures. They hired help when they could afford it, young men looking to learn the trade, and Mack proved to be as good a teacher as his father had been. In the spring of 1880, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. She and Mack were overjoyed, though also nervous. Parenthood was a responsibility unlike any other. But they had each other, and they had the life they had built together, and that gave them confidence. Their first child, a son, was born in January of 1881 during a snowstorm that reminded Mack of the night he had first met Beatrice. They named him Matthew after Mack's father, and from the moment Mack held that tiny, squalling baby in his arms, he knew a love he had never imagined possible. Beatrice was a natural mother, patient and loving, and Mack found that fatherhood suited him. He loved teaching Matthew about the horses, even when the boy was too young to understand. He would carry his son on his shoulders as he did his rounds, talking to him about everything and nothing. 2 years later, they had a daughter, whom they named Belle, and then another son, Marcus. 2 years after that. Their cabin, which had once seemed adequate, became too small, so they built a proper house on the Henderson land, a 2-story structure with a big kitchen and bedrooms for everyone. The horse business continued to thrive. The name Xander Stables became known throughout Montana and beyond. People came from as far as Wyoming and the Dakotas to buy their horses or to arrange breeding services. Mack and Beatrice hired more help, and what had started as a dream in a small barn became a successful, thriving operation. But through all the success and the busy years, Mack and Beatrice never forgot what had brought them together. Every year on the anniversary of the night they met, they would go to the original barn, the one where Storm had been born, and they would sit in the straw and remember. They would talk about how far they had come and about the promise Beatrice had made that had changed both their lives. Storm lived to the ripe old age of 22, producing countless offspring that carried on his excellent bloodlines. When he finally passed peacefully in his sleep, Mack and Beatrice buried him on their land with a marker that read, "Storm, born in a tempest, lived in peace, brought 2 hearts together." Their children grew up surrounded by horses and love. Matthew took to the business naturally and began helping his father train horses when he was just 12 years old. Belle developed a talent for healing, caring for sick and injured animals with a gentle touch that reminded Mack of her mother. Marcus was the dreamer, always drawing and painting, capturing the beauty of Montana on canvas. As the children grew older and more independent, Mack and Beatrice found themselves with more time to simply be together. They would take long rides across their land, sometimes racing like young people, other times just walking side by side. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, just as they had when they were first falling in love, and talk about their days. One evening, when Mack was 42 and Beatrice was 38, they were sitting together watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Their children were grown now. Matthew had married a lovely young woman from town and was running most of the day-to-day operations of the stables. Belle was studying with the doctor in Montrose, learning proper medicine to go along with her natural healing abilities. And Marcus had gone to San Francisco to study art, though he wrote often saying he missed Montana and planned to come home. "You ever think about that night?" Beatrice asked, leaning her head on Mack's shoulder. "The night we met, all the time," Mack admitted. "I think about how lost I was, how sure I was that I didn't need anyone, and then there you were, calling out in the storm, and everything changed. I was so scared that night," Beatrice said. "Scared I would lose the mare and the foal, scared I would lose my father's dream before it even really started. And then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I didn't even know I had said." Mack turned to look at his wife, and he was struck by how beautiful she still was. Yes, there were lines around her eyes now and silver threads in her dark hair, but to him, she was as lovely as the day he had first seen her in that barn. "You remember what you promised me?" he asked. Beatrice smiled. "That you would find a home where you belonged, where you were needed and wanted, that you would find real and lasting love." She reached up and cupped his cheek. "Did I keep my promise?" "Every single word of it," Mack said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me everything, Beatrice. A home, a family, a purpose. But most of all, you gave me yourself, and that was the greatest gift of all." "We gave each other those things," Beatrice corrected gently. "That's what love is, I think. Not one person saving the other, but two people building something together that neither could have built alone." They kissed then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 16 years of love and partnership and shared dreams. When they pulled apart, they sat in comfortable silence, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Life continued its steady rhythm. Matthew and his wife gave Mack and Beatrice their first grandchild, a little girl with Beatrice's green eyes. Belle finished her medical training and opened a practice in Montrose, becoming one of the first female doctors in Montana Territory. Marcus returned from San Francisco and built a studio on the ranch, where he painted landscapes and horses that sold for impressive sums. Montana achieved statehood in 1889, and the Xanders celebrated along with everyone else. The wild frontier was slowly becoming civilized, with proper towns and schools and railroads. But some things remained constant: the vast sky, the mountains in the distance, and the land that had given them their livelihood and their life. Mack and Beatrice grew old together, their love never diminishing but instead deepening with time. They had weathered hardships together, droughts and harsh winters and illnesses, but they had also celebrated countless joys. They had built not just a business but a legacy, one that their children and grandchildren would carry on. On a warm summer evening in 1903, when Mack was 66 and Beatrice was 62, they sat together on the porch of their house. They were surrounded by family, 3 children and 7 grandchildren, all gathered for a reunion. The air was filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing. Beatrice leaned against Mack, and he wrapped his arm around her just as he had done countless times before. "We did all right, didn't we?" she said softly. "Better than all right," Mack replied. "We built something beautiful, you and I." "It all started with a promise," Beatrice mused. "A promise made in a barn on a stormy night. Who would have thought that those words would have such power?" "You knew," Mack said, smiling down at her. "You told me that night that promises made from the heart have power. You believed it, and you made me believe it too." They watched as their grandson, Matthew's boy, led one of Storm's great-grandfoals around the yard. The colt was the image of his famous ancestor, all long legs and gentle eyes. The boy was patient with the young horse, just as Mack had taught his father and his father had taught him. "The legacy continues," Beatrice said with satisfaction. "Because of you," Mack said. "Because you had a dream and the courage to pursue it. Because you opened your heart to a drifter caught in a storm." "Because we found each other," Beatrice corrected. "Two people who needed each other at exactly the right moment. That's not just luck, Mack. That's fate. That's the universe answering a promise." As the sun set on another day, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink, Mack reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the young man he had been, lost and lonely, convinced he was better off alone. He thought about the night he had heard a woman's voice calling through the storm and had made the choice to answer. That choice had led him here, to this life filled with love and purpose and belonging. It had led him to Beatrice, his partner, his love, his home. The promise she had made him that night had come true in ways he could never have imagined. He had found not just love but a whole life, rich and full and meaningful. And as he sat there with his wife in his arms, surrounded by the family they had created and the land they had tended, Mack Xander knew that he was the luckiest man who had ever lived. The storm that had brought him to Beatrice's barn had been a tempest that changed everything, just like the colt they had saved together. From that chaos and uncertainty had come order and peace and joy. The years continued to pass gently. Mack and Beatrice remained active in the business well into their later years, though they increasingly left the heavy work to their children and the hands they employed. They became fixtures in Montrose, respected elders whose advice was sought and whose presence was valued. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1928, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The celebration was held at the ranch, with horses parading in honor of the couple who had built Xander stables from nothing but a dream and determination. People came from across Montana to pay their respects and to celebrate the love story that had become legendary in the area. At the celebration, Matthew stood up to give a speech. "My parents," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "taught me everything I know about horses. But more importantly, they taught me about love, about partnership, about what it means to build a life with another person. They showed me that true love isn't just about feelings. It's about choosing each other every single day through good times and bad. It's about working together toward a common goal. It's about keeping promises." There were tears in many eyes, including Mack's and Beatrice's. They held hands as their son spoke, their fingers intertwined as they had been for 5 decades. That night, alone in their bedroom, Beatrice looked at Mack and said, "50 years. Can you believe it?" "Sometimes it feels like 50 days, Mack replied. "Other times it feels like we've been together forever, like there was never a time when you weren't part of my life." "I know exactly what you mean," Beatrice said. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been thinking about that promise again, the one I made you the night we met. What about it? I promised you'd find a home where you belonged, where you were needed and wanted. I promised you'd find real and lasting love." Beatrice's eyes were shining in the lamplight. "But what I didn't realize at the time was that I was making that promise for myself too. Everything I promised you came true for me as well. You gave me a home, a place where I belong. You made me feel needed and wanted every single day. And you loved me with a love that has lasted and grown for 50 years. Mack pulled her close, and she rested her head over his heart, listening to its steady beat. "We were meant for each other," he said simply. "I truly believe that. The storm, the mare, the foal, all of it was leading us to each other." "I believe that too," Beatrice whispered. They fell asleep that way in each other's arms, just as they had done for thousands of nights before. Mack Xander passed away peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning in 1931, at the age of 79. Beatrice was beside him, holding his hand. She had woken early and noticed that his breathing had become shallow, and she had known instinctively that the end was near. She had climbed back into bed and wrapped herself around him, whispering words of love into his ear until his breathing stopped altogether. The funeral was one of the largest Montrose had ever seen. People came from across the state to pay their respects to a man who had been known for his integrity, his skill with horses, and his devotion to his family. But for Beatrice, the ceremony passed in a blur. The only thing that felt real was the ache in her chest, the absence of the man who had been her partner for more than 50 years. The family worried about Beatrice after Mack's death. She had always been so strong, but losing Mack seemed to dim her light. She still smiled and interacted with her children and grandchildren, but everyone could see that a part of her was missing. One evening, about 6 months after Mack's death, Belle found her mother in the original barn, the one where Storm had been born all those years ago. Beatrice was sitting in the straw, running her hands through it absently. "Mama," Belle said gently. "Are you all right?" Beatrice looked up at her daughter and smiled, though her eyes were sad. "I was just remembering. This is where it all started, you know, where I met your father." It was a night just like this, actually. A storm was coming. Belle sat down beside her mother. "Tell me the story again." So Beatrice did. She told Belle about the storm, about the mare struggling to give birth, about the stranger who had appeared out of the darkness to help. She told her about the promise she had made, about how those words had seemed to create their own reality. "He was the love of my life," Beatrice said when the story was done. "The great love, the kind that comes once in a lifetime if you're very, very lucky." "I know, Mama," Belle said, taking her mother's hand. "And he loved you just as much. Everyone could see it. You two were magic together." "We were, weren't we?" Beatrice said, and for the first time since Mack's death, her smile reached her eyes. "We had something special." Beatrice lived for another 5 years after Mack's passing. She remained involved with the ranch, offering advice and watching with pride as her children and grandchildren continued to build on the legacy she and Mack had started. She took particular joy in her great-grandchildren, seeing in them the future of the family and the land. But everyone could see that she was waiting, that her heart was no longer fully invested in this world. She would often be found in the original barn, sitting in the straw, a distant smile on her face. When asked what she was thinking about, she would always give the same answer: "I'm remembering promises." On a warm autumn evening in 1936, Beatrice passed away peacefully, surrounded by her family. Her last words were, "I'm ready. He's waiting for me." She was buried beside Mack on their land under a large cottonwood tree with a view of the mountains. The headstone read, "Beatrice Xander, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, she believed in the power of promises." The ranch continued to thrive under the management of Matthew and eventually his children. Xander Stables became known throughout the West as a premier horse breeding operation, with a reputation for excellence that stretched back generations. The story of Mack and Beatrice became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of what true love looked like. The original barn, where it all began, was preserved as a sort of family shrine. A plaque was installed that told the story of that stormy night in 1878, when a cowboy helped a woman deliver a foal and received a promise that changed both their lives forever. And sometimes, on stormy nights, family members swore they could see 2 figures in that barn, sitting close together in the straw, watching over a mare and her newborn foal. They said the figures would hold hands and smile, and then fade away like mist, leaving behind only the scent of lavender and leather and the feeling that love, real and true and lasting love, never truly dies. The legacy of Mack and Beatrice Xander lived on, not just in the horses that bore their ranch's brand, but in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their values. The promise made on a stormy night had come true, not just for one night or one lifetime, but for generations. They had found their home, their love, and their purpose, and in doing so, they had created something that would last forever.